My daughter walked into the dark living room and was completely shocked when she saw me trembling in the chair. "Dad, why is there no food in the house? Where did the $20,000 go?" she whispered. My son smirked and said he's not aware of anything anymore. "I'll handle the money." What my son didn't know was that my daughter already had all the evidence. She quietly pulled out a bottle of pills containing the proof. My son looked at it and froze in shock. Welcome everyone. Before the story continues, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know your location. Quick note: this is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Some elements are dramatized. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental, but the message is meant to be meaningful. The darkness in my own living room was so thick, I couldn't see the calloused palms of my own hands that had built half of Tucson, but now lacked the strength to even flick a light switch. I am Charles Wright, a 70-year-old retired construction foreman who spent 36 years building the skyline of this desert, now finding myself a prisoner in my own home. I sat perfectly still in the armchair, listening to the suffocating silence of a house that used to ring with laughter and the heavy thud of work boots. Now the only sound was the shallow, thready rasp of my own breathing. A thick gray wool seemed to have wrapped itself around my brain, dampening every thought before it could take shape. I tried to remember what day it was, but the numbers slipped through my mind like dry desert sand. The air smelled of stale dust and the lingering clinical scent of floor wax that Nicole always insisted on using. Nicole Wright, 40, my daughter-in-law, who handled the vitamins and the checkbook with the same cold, clinical efficiency she used in her pharmaceutical sales job, was the one who left the bottle on the counter. "Just take these, Charles," she had said earlier that evening, her voice like ice scraping against a windshield. "They will keep your strength up." I had swallowed them without question, trusting the family name that I had spent my life honoring. But as the hours bled into the night, the weight in my limbs grew unbearable. This was not the simple fatigue of an old man who had worked too hard. This was a heavy, sinking lethargy that felt engineered, a chemical anchor dragging me into the depths of my own mind. I realized then that the vitamins Nicole had been insisting on were the direct cause of this fog, not my age. How does a man go from pouring concrete foundations to being unable to find his own front door in the dark? The question echoed through the empty hallway, mocking the weakness in my knees. I attempted to stand my fingers gripping the frayed fabric of the armchair, but my legs felt like they were made of damp cardboard. I collapsed back down, a metallic taste blooming at the back of my throat, sharp and bitter. The red numbers of the digital clock on the VCR blurred into a single bloody smear of light. I was starving in a house worth $600,000, yet I couldn't even navigate the 20 feet to the pantry. The fridge hummed a low, mocking sound that reminded me I was alone. A sliver of moonlight finally cut through the heavy curtains, striking the kitchen counter like a silver blade. It illuminated a small, amber plastic bottle sitting next to a glass of tepid water. My instinct, honed by decades of spotting cracks in structural steel, screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. I forced myself out of the chair and onto the floor. The tile was freezing against my palms as I crawled inch by agonizing inch toward the light. My vision swam and the world tilted, but I reached up and swept the bottle into my hand. The dry, papery feeling of the label felt significant, a piece of evidence in a crime I was only just beginning to understand. I squinted, trying to focus on the fine print under the pale Tucson moon. "Vitamin B," I whispered to the empty room. "No, that is not what this says." I turned the bottle toward the light, and the word Ambien screamed back at me in black ink. I wasn't dying of old age. I was being erased. The amber bottle felt heavy in my hand, a silent witness to the betrayal currently pulsing through my veins. My son's face hadn't looked like a thief's when he knelt by my chair 2 years ago. It had looked like a life raft, and I had been a drowning man foolish enough to grab it. Looking back at that afternoon in the garden, the memory now plays in my mind, with a clarity that only sudden sharp anger can provide. I had tripped over a misplaced shovel, the rough texture of the garden dirt stinging my palms as I went down. It was a minor slip, the kind that happens to men half my age, but my son Derek Wright, 45, and drowning in the debt of his construction business, walked in with a false smile that couldn't hide the desperation etched into his face. He hadn't just helped me up. He had descended upon me with a performance of concern that was as thick as the humidity before a monsoon. I realize now that the fall wasn't just a random accident. It was the signal they had been waiting for to pounce on my autonomy. I can still smell the expensive cloying scent of his cologne as he leaned over me, his voice dropping into that low, protective frequency he used to sell bad contracts. "Dad, we just want you to be safe." He had whispered, his hands steadying me with a grip that felt more like a shackle than a support. Let Nicole handle the stress of the bills. The signing of the power of attorney in 2023 felt like watching a slow-motion car crash from the driver's seat. I remember the scratch of the pen against the paper, a sound that should have warned me I was signing away my own life. "Sign here, Dad," he had said. "It's just for the emergency transfers. Trust is a heavy foundation, but once the rebar rusts out from the inside, the whole structure collapses without a sound." I stood there in my dark kitchen, my heart thumping against my ribs, like a trapped bird connecting the dots of the last 2 years. Every blackout, every moment, where I couldn't remember if I had eaten or if the sun had already set, was measured in milligrams. Nicole didn't just stumble into this arrangement. She had calculated the dosage to keep me perpetually docile, a ghost haunting my own hallways. I recall her standing in this very kitchen, the clinical citrus scent of her perfume hanging in the air like a warning. "You're just tired, Charles," she would say with a thin, sharp smile. "Age does that to the best of us." I wasn't just losing my money. I was losing the man I had been for 70 years, one vitamin at a time. The cold realization settled into my bones, sharpening my focus as the chemical fog began to retreat. I looked at the kitchen counter, realizing my life was being systematically traded for business liquidity and construction loans. I wasn't a father to them anymore. I was a liquid asset. I knew I couldn't confront them yet. As long as they believed I was a vegetable, a shell of a man waiting for the next dose, they wouldn't expect me to fight back. I reached for the heavy flour jar on the counter, the ceramic cold against my skin. I tucked the amber bottle deep into the back of the flour, burying the evidence of their crime. The man they wanted me to be was dead, but the man I actually was finally waking up. My fingers shook as they hovered over the plastic buttons of the wall-mounted phone, a relic from a time when my family still lived under this roof without secrets. The cold, coiled texture of the phone cord felt like a lifeline and a noose all at once as I pulled it toward the shadows of the pantry. For 4 years, I had let my pride act as a wall between me and the only person who might actually save me. I realized now that the silence hadn't been accidental. Derek had been the one to whisper that she was too busy, that she didn't care about the old man in Tucson anymore. He had actively sabotaged us, intercepting the very calls I was now trying to make, keeping me isolated like a job site without a foreman. The rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the landline buttons felt deafening in the hollowed-out silence of my kitchen. I forced my memory to recall the 10 digits I had tried so hard to forget. The image of our last argument in 2021 flashed before me, sharp as a jagged piece of rebar. "You are wasting that MBA, Laura," I had shouted across this very room. "Teaching is a hobby, not a career." My pride had driven her away, and Derek had moved in like a squatter to claim the territory I had cleared. Now, as the line began to hum with static-filled silence, I felt the crushing weight of my own arrogance. Is an apology worth the price of a house, or is it the only thing that can truly save one? The question burned in my chest as the first ring echoed in my ear. "Pick up, sweetheart," I whispered the words, catching in my dry throat. "Please just pick up." The second ring felt like an hour. On the third, the line clicked open. "Dad." A voice said, thick with sleep and an immediate jagged edge of suspicion. "It is 2 in the morning. Is everything okay?" My daughter Laura Wright, 42, stood in my mind's eye, with the same fierce intensity her mother once had. Her eyes scanning my diminished state with a professor's sharp scrutiny, even through the phone. Believe me, there is no sound more terrifying or more beautiful than the voice of a child you thought you had lost forever. "Sweetheart," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of the Ambien bottle hidden in the flour and the empty shelves of my refrigerator. "I need you to come home. Everything is wrong. Everything." I felt the hot sting of tears in my eyes, a weakness I hadn't allowed myself since the day we buried Dorothy. I told her I was sorry that my pride was a mistake that had nearly cost me my life. There was a heartbeat of silence, a pause that felt like the edge of a cliff. I expected a lecture, a reminder of every cutting word I had hurled at her when she left for Oregon. But the power shifted in an instant. Laura didn't hesitate or demand a 10-page explanation. She immediately switched into a protective mode I didn't know she still held for me. "I am coming, Dad," she said, her voice turning into cold steel. "Don't take anything else they give you. Just stay awake." I hung up the receiver just as a pair of headlights swept across the kitchen curtains, a blinding sweep of high beams that turned the dark kitchen into a crime scene. A silver truck idled at the end of my driveway, like a shark waiting for blood, its engine a low, predatory growl in the Tucson night. I woke up before the Tucson sun could even scorch the horizon, my mind cutting through the residual cobwebs of Nicole's vitamins like a sharp blade through rotted canvas. For months I had been adrift in a sea of gray, but today the edges of the world were hard and unforgiving. I stayed under the covers for a moment, listening. The silver truck I had seen idling like a shark last night was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. I realized then that the vehicle wasn't just my son Derek checking in on his investment. It was a sentry, a hired security guard sent by Arthur Blackwell to monitor the perimeter of what they now considered an asset rather than a human being. The sharp, stinging clarity in the back of my throat was a gift of the adrenaline now replacing the sedatives. I sat up, my bones aching with a cold that had nothing to do with the desert autumn. As I walked through the house, I performed a silent, sober inventory of decay. The wooden dining table, once the centerpiece of Dorothy's Sunday dinners, was coated in a gritty texture of dust that felt like ash under my fingertips. I looked at the thermostat and saw it had been spiked down to a bone-chilling temperature. They were saving pennies on the heating while my legacy bled out through their fingers. The house smelled of unwashed laundry and broken promises. I opened the pantry, and the sight was even worse. There was no real sustenance here, just boxes of saltines and canned broth. They didn't just drug me. They let my life wither while I watched through a haze. It was a slow, controlled environmental starvation, designed to keep me weak, compliant, and ready for the disposal they clearly had planned. "When did I stop smelling the dust?" I whispered to the empty hallway. But the only answer was the low, persistent hum of the outdated refrigerator. I made my way to the bedroom and knelt by the nightstand, reaching into the gap where a loose floorboard hid my old smartphone. The blue-white glare of the screen in the dim room made me wince, but the vibration against my palm was a heartbeat. There was a text from Laura. She had secured the first flight out of Portland and would be landing at 3 p.m. Her words were a shield, first flight. "Be there 3 p.m. Don't take vitamins. Hold on, Dad. Hope is a dangerous thing for a man who's been buried alive, but it's the only oxygen I had left." I felt a surge of vindication so strong it made my hands shake. She was coming. The professor, the daughter I had judged so harshly for her choices, was the only one brave enough to answer the siren. But as I checked the calendar on the kitchen wall, a new dread settled in. I found a scrawled note in Nicole's handwriting in the margins: 4 p.m. wellness consultation. I knew that name now. Blackwell. Today wasn't just about a bank visit or a welfare check. Derek had scheduled his fixer to arrive just 1 hour after Laura's flight was due to land. The race was on, and the track was narrower than I had ever imagined. I stared at the timestamp on Laura's text, then at the clock on the wall. I had exactly 6 hours to prepare for a war I wasn't even sure I could win. The crunch of gravel under Derek's heavy tires sounded like a death sentence, forcing me to slump back into my armchair and let my jaw hang loose, a mask of senility I had to wear to survive. I gripped the rough wool texture of the armchair, with my palms forcing the strength out of my hands until they looked like the trembling claws of a man who couldn't remember his own name. The front door groaned open, bringing with it the smell of diesel exhaust and cheap coffee on Derek's breath as he burst into the room. He was a whirlwind of high-strung agitation, his face flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the Tucson heat. "Dad, did you call Laura?" He demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Why would you do that?" Without telling me, I let my eyes wander toward the ceiling, offering him nothing but a vacant, watery blink. I realized then that his protective concern was a frantic reaction. The bank's fraud department must have already flagged the unusual activity before I even made my move. He paced the floor, his boots creating a rhythmic thud that vibrated through my bones. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small amber bottle. "Here, take your supplement," he said, his tone shifting into that terrifyingly soft, condescending frequency. "You are getting worked up over nothing." He pressed the pill toward my lips, but I triggered a sudden hacking cough, my hands shaking with practiced weakness. The pill hit the floor with a sharp clack, disappearing into the shadows near the rug. How do you look at the child you raised and see a predator counting down the minutes until your house belongs to him? Derek didn't notice the deception. His phone chirped, and he turned away to answer a work call, his voice dropping into a desperate whisper about payroll and frozen credit lines. As I sat there in my forced silence, I was pulled back to 2021, to the very spot where Derek was now standing. I remembered my own booming voice echoing in this room, shouting at Laura that her teaching degree was a waste of a good MBA, and that she was throwing her life away. "Teaching isn't a career, Laura," I had roared. "It's a hobby for people who can't cut it in the real world." I remembered the look on her face, but more importantly, I remembered Derek. He hadn't been the peacemaker. He had leaned in, whispering in my ear that she was being disrespectful to the family legacy, actively stoking the fire of my pride. "Let her go, Dad," he had said then. "If she doesn't value what we've built, she doesn't deserve a seat at the table." The floorboards groaned under his boots, a sound I once associated with safety, now a warning of betrayal. I watched him through half-closed lids as he finished his call, his face pale. He muttered something about the city contract, a deal he had told me was close to signing, being canceled months ago. My house wasn't a family home to him anymore. It was his only liquid asset left. As Derek slammed the front door, leaving me in the gathering shadows, I caught a glimpse of his truck through the window. There, sitting on the passenger seat, was a bright yellow folder with bold black lettering, "Power of Sale Notice." It was dated for next Tuesday. The war wasn't coming. It was already at my doorstep. The house grew cold as the Tucson sun dipped, but it was the sound of Nicole's key in the lock that made the blood in my veins turn to slush. I had been sitting in the gathering dark. The image of that yellow "Power of Sale" folder burned into my retinas. The front door clicked shut, and I quickly assumed the posture of the hollow man Derek expected to see. I let my head loll toward the window, my eyes vacant. Nicole entered the kitchen first, the smell of lukewarm, greasy takeout following her like a bad omen. I realized then that she was the true architect of this misery. It wasn't just Derek's desperation. Nicole was the one who had hunted down Arthur Blackwell. She was the one who suggested using the Ambien to manufacture a rapid cognitive decline, a chemical muzzle to ensure my quiet admission into memory care. She walked into the living room and set the bag on the coffee table. "You're looking a bit more alert today, Charles," she said, her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness. "We can't have you getting overexcited before Laura gets here." She reached into her purse, and the plastic rattle of the pill bottle sounded like a rattlesnake in the dry brush. "Down the hatch now. I promised Derek I would see you settle in." She leaned over me, her eyes tracking my movement with a predatory intensity. I used a sleight-of-hand trick I had learned on high-rise construction sites 40 years ago to keep the boys entertained. I brought the glass to my lips, making a show of swallowing while the pill stayed pinned between my tongue and teeth. As I lowered the glass, I slid the tablet into the cuff of my sleeve. The scratch of the pill against my skin was the only thing keeping me grounded. Her laughter was the sound of a shovel hitting dry Arizona dirt. She patted my hand and retreated to the kitchen to unpack the food, leaving me in the shadows. A moment later, the blue, flickering light of the old Bluetooth speaker on the bookshelf caught my eye. It was an old unit I had forgotten was even paired to her device. Her phone rang, and through some technological glitch or Derek's haste to connect the call, routed directly into the room. Derek's voice, tinny and laced with static, filled the space. "Is he out yet?" he demanded. "We need that signature on the final deed transfer by tomorrow morning." Nicole's voice came back from the kitchen, sounding sharp and efficient. "He is halfway there. If Laura starts asking about the pension when she arrives, tell her he spent it on the investments she was too busy to help with." When does a son stop seeing a father and start seeing a bank account with a heartbeat? The question vibrated in my chest as I listened to them discuss the notary they had already contacted for the morning. They were going to finalize the transfer and render me homeless before the sun hit its zenith. My own son was talking about me as if I were a piece of equipment to be liquidated. The Bluetooth speaker crackled with Derek's final chilling instruction. "Whatever happens, he doesn't leave that house tomorrow unless it's in a transport van." I sat in the silence that followed, a cold clarity washing over me. The trap was set, and the jaw was closing. I lay in the dark, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting the minutes until the doorbell would announce my only hope or my final capture. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford. Not with the memory of Derek's voice still vibrating through the Bluetooth speaker like a death sentence. He wanted me in a transport van by morning, stripped of my home and my autonomy. I spent the dawn hours rehearsing the most difficult performance of my life. I had to look broken, a fading patriarch slipping into the fog of dementia, while my mind remained a sharpened blade hidden in a velvet sheath. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall felt like a hammer, striking a nail into my own coffin as I watched the driveway, praying for a rental car instead of a transport van. The sunlight crawling across the floorboards felt aggressive and mocking, illuminating the dust of a house that had become my prison. I had overheard their backup plan. While they thought I was sedated, a private physician was scheduled to arrive at 4 o'clock to provide the backdated diagnosis they needed to lock me away forever. It was a race against a medical lockout, and I was running it from a stationary armchair. When 3 o'clock finally arrived, a white sedan turned into the gravel drive. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I saw her then. Laura stepped out of the car, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. She looked exactly like her mother, sharp, formidable, and radiating a controlled fury I hadn't seen in years. She moved with a purpose that the heavy, stale air of this house couldn't stifle. Laura didn't just walk into the room. She was a storm front rolling over a parched desert, and Derek was finally standing in the path of the lightning. I forced my muscles to slacken, slumping deep into my leather chair. I let my jaw hang slightly, my eyes unfocused, wearing the mask of the drugged invalid. When she entered the living room, the smell of her rain-scented perfume cut through the scent of old wood and neglect. I saw her face crumble, the warrior's mask slipping to reveal the grieving daughter. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking as she knelt beside me. "Oh God, Dad, what have they done to you?" I wanted to reach out and pull her close to tell her I was still here, but I remained still. I'm here now, she said, clutching my cold, damp hand. I'm not leaving again. Before she could even set down her travel bag, the front door was thrown open without a knock. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot. Derek and Nicole strode in their faces tight, with a performative concern that didn't reach their eyes. They moved like a coordinated unit, intent on severing the connection before it could take root. Laura Nicole cried out, her voice a shrill imitation of warmth. We didn't expect you until this evening. Dad is having a very difficult afternoon, very confused. It is probably best if you check into your hotel first and come back when he is more stable. I watched them through hooded eyes, feeling the heat of Laura's indignation rise beside me. How do you tell your daughter you are sane when you have spent months pretending to be a ghost? I didn't fly across the country to go to a hotel. Derek, Laura snapped her voice like ice. I am staying right here. Nicole stepped forward, the sharp, paper-cut sound of a legal folder opening filling the silence. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory gleam. Charles, dear, it's time to sign those papers Derek mentioned. I watched the ink in the fountain pen tremble just above the signature line, a drop of black liquid threatening to end my life, before Laura's hand clamped down on Nicole's wrist like a steel trap. The predatory gleam in Nicole's eyes flickered, replaced by a momentary flash of shock. Put the pen down, Nicole, Laura said, her voice steady and dangerous. My father isn't signing a grocery list, let alone a legal transfer in this condition. I remained slumped in my chair, projecting a glazed, faraway look, though inside I wanted to cheer. Derek stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of annoyance and poorly concealed panic. We're only trying to help Laura, he argued. You haven't seen his episodes. You don't know how bad it gets. Laura didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her academic posture adding an invisible weight to her authority. I'm seeing everything I need to see right now, she snapped. This house is a disaster. My father is practically catatonic, and you're shoving contracts in his face before I can even get him a glass of water. Get out. Both of you. Derek tried to protest, mentioning the doctor coming at 4, but Laura threatened to call the police for trespassing. The shame of a potential public scene in the driveway finally forced them to retreat. The hollow sound of the front door slamming felt like the first breath of fresh air in months. The air in the house was thick with the scent of pine cleaner and betrayal, a chemical mask over the rot underneath. Once the house fell quiet, I felt the weight of the silence press against my ears. Laura didn't come to me immediately. Instead, her demeanor shifted from warrior to investigator. I watched through half-closed lids as she began a methodical sweep of the kitchen. She pulled open cupboards, noting the lack of protein and the barren shelves. When she reached the pantry, she began moving jars. She found the amber bottle I had hidden in the flour jar. I saw the gritty feel of flour on her fingertips as she pulled it out, her face going pale as she read the label. Ambien, not B12, not a heart pill, a chemical muzzle. Dad, I found it. She whispered, her voice trembling with cold fury. Why is there a bottle of prescription sedatives in the flour? I forced my voice to sound weak, sticking to the role for just a few moments longer. Nicole. She said they were for my heart, my memory. Laura's eyes didn't just show pity. They showed a dawning realization of a crime. She kept digging, moving to the trash can under the sink. Beneath a layer of paper towels, she pulled out a second bottle, this one completely empty, suggesting they were doubling the dosage whenever a big decision or a bank statement was due. My stomach churned at the confirmation of what I had suspected. They weren't just managing me. They were erasing me. Laura walked back into the living room, the evidence clutched in her hand. She looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the moment she realized I was more present than I appeared. But before she could speak, I tilted my head ever so slightly toward the ceiling. I had noticed it earlier, the sharp, rhythmic clicking that shouldn't be there. Laura followed my gaze up, her eyes narrowing at the smoke detector near the hallway vent. A tiny blinking red light sat nestled inside the casing, a digital eye watching our every move. The sight of the power of sale folder Nicole had tried to hide on the end table suddenly felt less threatening than that small electronic betrayer. Laura leaned in close, her lips barely moving. "They're listening, Dad." Every word. The screech of Laura's Sharpie against a yellow legal pad was the only voice we had left in a room that had grown ears, each stroke a silent scream against the shadows. I watched the persistent, mocking blink of the red camera light in the vent, a digital sentinel Derek had installed to monitor my decline. We didn't dare speak aloud. The air in the living room was stagnant, smelling of Sharpie fumes and the metallic tang of fear. Laura sat on the floor by my feet, the yellow pad resting on her knees. She wrote 4 words in bold, aggressive ink. "Tell me the numbers." I took the pen from her, my hand still a bit shaky from the lack of real food, and began to detail the architecture of my ruin. I wrote about the $20,000 monthly pension and the power of attorney I had signed under what I now knew was a drug-induced fog. I watched her eyes widen in horror as I scratched out the timeline of my compliance. I signed it. I wrote the ink bleeding into the paper. I thought I was helping him. Laura took the pen back, her jaw tight. "You weren't helping him, Dad," she wrote beneath my confession. "You were funding his burial of the truth," as she wrote. A cold, sinking feeling settled in my gut. I realized then that the security lock on my accounts wasn't just a simple password change. Nicole had systematically reported me as mentally incapacitated to the bank's fraud department months ago. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had institutionalized my digital identity before I even knew I was being erased. How do you fight a war when the enemy has stolen your identity and the battlefield is a screen you can no longer access? It was a question that hung over us like a shroud. Laura opened her laptop, the blinding white light of the screen cutting through the dark room like a searchlight. She tried to log into my online banking portals using the old passwords I had memorized over decades of careful management. Every single one had been changed. She tried the recovery options, but the recovery phone number had been redirected to Nicole's device. Each attempt met a digital wall, a message stating that the account was restricted due to the owner's documented health status. She tried the bank's mobile app, only to receive a final chilling security lock notification. The screen seemed to pulse with a cold indifference. Every avenue was blocked, every door bolted from the inside. 0. That was the only number left that felt honest in this house of mirrors. We were trapped in a fortress built from my own life's work, and the keys were in the hands of the people who wanted me gone. Laura didn't give up. She moved to the property records, her fingers flying across the keys with a frantic energy. The scratchy sound of paper tearing from the legal pad punctuated the silence as she took notes. Then she stopped. Her entire body went rigid. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen. She had found the mortgage records. It wasn't just that Derek had taken out a loan. My forged digital signature had been used to approve a massive line of credit against the house. It was 80% exhausted. They hadn't just spent my pension. They had hollowed out the very ground I stood on. Laura slammed the laptop shut, with a sound like a gunshot, and grabbed the Sharpie one last time. She wrote in jagged, angry letters that nearly tore through the page, "Bank of America. 9 a.m. We don't leave until we see a manager." The landline phone screamed in the dark, a jagged electronic serration that tore through the silence of the living room every 10 minutes, like an interrogator's lamp. The night didn't pass so much as it stood still, a heavy, suffocating weight that only the morning sun could lift. Each ring was a reminder that Derek was still out there pacing his own cage of desperation. Laura refused to answer, her face a mask of cold determination, illuminated by the pale blue glow of her smartphone. We sat in the kitchen, the smell of cold coffee and stale adrenaline hanging between us. When the machine finally picked up, Derek's voice filled the room, oscillating between a weeping plea and a low, guttural snarl. "Laura, he's confused," my son cried out to the empty room. "You're going to give him a stroke if you keep this up. He's sundowning, for God's sake. Just let us come over and help him." But as the voicemails stacked up, the mask of fraternal concern slipped. He began rambling about someone named Arthur, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He pleaded that Arthur Blackwell couldn't find out she was here, that everything would be ruined if the house wasn't handled quietly. It was the sound of a man who wasn't just in debt to a bank, but to people who didn't use paperwork to collect. He sounded like a man who was running out of time and oxygen. Silence in this house used to be a comfort. Now it was the thin, tight wire of a trip mine. I watched Laura stare at the answering machine, her eyes hard. "He's perfectly clear, Derek," she whispered to the shadows. "Clearer than he's been in years." I felt a surge of pride, but it was quickly dampened by the low, predatory hum vibrating through the floorboards. I stood up, my joints protesting, and moved toward the front window. My hands felt dry and papery as I gripped the heavy velvet curtains, pulling them back just an inch to peer into the Tucson night. The silver truck was parked at the curb, but it wasn't alone. A second dark sedan sat across the street, its headlights extinguished, but its presence heavy and undeniable. "They aren't just watching, sweetheart," I said, my voice barely audible over the hum of the idling engines. "They're guarding the exit." Laura joined me at the glass, her breath hitching as she saw the silhouette of a man in the sedan. Derek hadn't just been watching us through the smoke detector. He had hired actual muscle to ensure I didn't leave the property before the notary arrived at 8. We were under a midnight siege. How many years of love does it take to erase the sight of your own son hunting you? I looked at the street and realized the front driveway was a dead end. But then a memory flickered in the back of my mind, a ghost of the man I used to be when I built this life. I remembered a side gate through the back alley that I had installed for construction equipment years ago. It was tucked behind the detached garage, likely forgotten by Derek, because it was overgrown with thick desert scrub and mesquite. If the gate still held, it led to a narrow service road 3 blocks over. "We don't use the exit they expect," I told her, the plan forming in my mind with the precision of an old blueprint. A flashlight beam from the idling car suddenly swept across the front of the house, lingering on the window where I stood, the light as cold and clinical as a searchlight in a prison yard. The first gray light of the Tucson dawn began to bleed over the mountains, but there was no warmth in it, only the looming weight of the deadline. We didn't use the front door. We crawled through the prickly pear cactus and the rusted latch of the back alley gate like thieves escaping our own history. The scratch of dry mesquite branches against my jacket sounded like 1,000 tiny warnings in the stillness. I had built this gate in 1982 to haul in lumber for the house's addition, a secret exit that Derek, in all his arrogant confidence, had completely overlooked. "Keep your head down, sweetheart," I whispered, feeling the heavy metallic taste of fear in the back of my throat. "If they see the dust kicking up, they will know we are moving." Laura didn't hesitate, her movements sharp and determined, as she guided me through the overgrown rear of the property. As we moved, she leaned in close to reveal that she had done more than just plan an escape. She had alerted a contact in the state attorney's elder abuse task force. This wasn't just a bank visit anymore. It was a formal setup designed to leave a paper trail that Derek could never erase. "I've got the car, Dad," she urged, her voice a low anchor in the chaos. "Just 10 more feet." We reached her rental car, which she had wisely parked 2 blocks away, and the doors clicked shut with a finality that made my heart race. The cold, clinical smell of the rental car's upholstery felt alien compared to the stale, medicinal air of my home. As Laura pulled away, the rhythmic thumping of the tires over the road's expansion joints became the heartbeat of our flight. I looked down at my hands, gnarled and trembling slightly, and saw more than just aging skin. I saw 1995. I remembered coming to this very bank with Dorothy on a Tuesday morning. We had just hit a milestone in our savings, and we opened this specific pension account with a handshake and a dream of a quiet retirement. Your mother wore her Sunday best. The day we opened this account, I told Laura, my voice thick with nostalgia. She called it our Freedom Fund. She said it was the proof that all our hard work had finally meant something. It occurred to me then that every dollar Derek and Nicole had drained was a piece of the life we built together, a physical desecration of Dorothy's memory. How many miles of desert road does a man have to travel before he stops being a victim and starts being a witness? I didn't have the answer. But I knew that every mile Broadway Boulevard took us was a mile closer to the truth. We're going to get it back, Dad, Laura promised. All of it. The bank's logo loomed ahead, a red, white, and blue fortress that held the remains of my life. The blinding glare of the morning sun hit the glass facade, momentarily searing my eyes. It was 8:55 a.m. As Laura turned into the lot, the short shock of reality hit me. We weren't as invisible as we thought. I watched the rearview mirror as a familiar silver truck swerved into the entrance behind us, tires screeching across the asphalt like a predator that had just realized its prey had reached the safety of a cage. Derek. I realized with a sickening jolt that the security team outside the house must have GPS-tracked Laura's phone. I saw the reflection of Derek's truck in the glass doors as we approached the entrance, his face contorted in a mask of desperate rage as he threw his door open while the vehicle was still rolling. The air conditioning of the lobby hit me like a wall of ice, but it wasn't enough to cool the fire in my chest. I didn't wait for the teller to greet us. I walked straight past the velvet ropes, my old foreman's gate returning, as I headed for the door labeled James Richardson, branch manager. Behind me, the heavy glass doors swung open with a violent thud. Derek burst into the bank, his face a mask of sweating, frantic panic that looked more like guilt than concern. He lunged toward me, trying to catch my arm to pull me back toward the exit. "Dad, don't do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You're confused. Let's just go home and talk." I felt his fingers brush my sleeve, but before he could get a grip, Laura stepped between us. Her voice was a whip crack that stopped the entire lobby in its tracks, freezing the tellers behind their glass partitions. "Touch him again, Derek, and I'll have the security guard put you in zip ties," she promised. Her eyes were twin points of steel. I didn't look back. I stepped into the office, the clinical ozone-scented air of the bank wrapping around me as I shut the door on my son's muffled, desperate shouting. I knew then that the investment allocations Nicole had mentioned were a total fabrication. The money wasn't even sitting in fake accounts. It was being bled out as cash allowances handed over to Arthur Blackwell under the guise of consulting fees. My life was being liquidated into a monster's pockets. James Richardson, 52, the branch manager who had seen me through 3 decades of deposits, sat behind his mahogany desk with a look of growing dread. He looked at my identification and then at the power of attorney papers on file, his brow furrowed. "Charles, it's been a while," he said, his voice hesitant as the rapid, rhythmic click-click of the mouse filled the small room. He began scrolling through the transaction history, his professional mask slowly crumbling into an expression of genuine concern. The monitor's glow felt like a blow to the chest. He stared at the screen for a long time, his face growing paler with every click. "Mr. Wright, I've been with this branch 12 years, he whispered. "I've never seen a depletion this aggressive." He turned the monitor toward me and I saw a relentless waterfall of red text. For 24 months, $10,000 deposits had vanished into something called Wright Construction LLC, a company I had retired from years ago. "Show me the bottom line, James. Just tell me what's left," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. My throat felt dry and hollow, the air in the office suddenly too thin to breathe. "How do you count the value of 36 years of sweat?" When it's been reduced to a three-digit number on a screen, I thought of Dorothy and the Sundays we spent planning our quiet future, a future that was currently being erased by a computer cursor. The blinding white light of the spreadsheet on the monitor seemed to burn into my retinas. Richardson hesitated, his eyes refusing to meet mine as he clicked one final time. "There's one more thing, Charles," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the office. "A final transfer of $50,000, your entire emergency savings, was authorized just 2 hours ago. It's still in the processing queue." He cleared his throat, a look of profound sorrow crossing his face. $327, Charles. That is all that remains of your life's work. The room went silent. The kind of silence you only find at the bottom of a deep, dark hole. $327. The number felt like a physical blow, a cold weight pressing against my chest, until the air in James Richardson's office felt too thin to breathe. I didn't hesitate. I gripped the bank manager's fountain pen with the same steady resolve I once used to sign off on a skyscraper's foundation, and I initiated the destruction of my son's lies. The scratch of the expensive pen on the heavy affidavit paper was the only sound in the clinical space. "If I sign this, James, what happens to the money?" I asked, my voice gravelly but firm. "Everything connected to these transfers stops moving, Charles." He replied, his face illuminated by the sharp, clinical glare of the computer screen. "A hard freeze on all outgoing funds, including the accounts for Wright Construction, LLC. Immediately." "Good," I said, leaning back as the sharp smell of laser-printed documents filled the air. "I'm tired of being the only one standing still." Laura stood beside me, her hand a warm, grounding weight on my shoulder. As I finished the final signature, a ripple of digital consequences began to spread through the bank's internal security protocol. James explained that because of the sheer volume of pension funds involved and the documented sedation I had endured, this was no longer a simple civil matter. The hard freeze would automatically flag these transactions for the Federal Crimes Division. Is it still a betrayal if you're simply handing back the shovel your son used to bury you? I didn't feel like a father in that moment. I felt like a judge. Less than 5 minutes after the ink dried, the rhythmic vibration of Laura's phone on the mahogany desk made us all jump. The caller ID displayed Derek's name. Laura glanced at me and I nodded. She tapped the speakerphone icon. The speaker crackled with a sound like tearing metal, my son's soul coming apart. "What did you do?" Derek screamed, his voice unrecognizable, high-pitched, frantic, and filled with a cornered animal's rage. "The account is locked. I have crews on site. Laura, I have payroll due in an hour. My suppliers are calling me saying their payments were clawed back." He was hyperventilating, the tinny, distorted screaming filling the quiet office with a sense of impending collapse. "You have 48 hours of my sweat in your veins, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through his hysterics. "Not another drop. You've just killed the company, Dad," he wailed. "You've destroyed us. I have obligations. I have people I owe." The cold, dry air of the office hit my damp forehead as the reality of his desperation settled in. Then his panic took a sharper, more dangerous turn. "You don't understand." He choked out, accidentally revealing the depth of his rot. "I didn't just spend the cash. I had to co-sign a massive high-interest loan using your identity, Dad. Arthur Blackwell was the facilitator. He's the one who made the numbers work on the back end." Derek's voice dropped to a terrifying low whisper that made the hair on my neck stand up. "You think you won, Dad? You just signed the foreclosure on your own front door. If Blackwell doesn't get his VIG because the accounts are frozen, we don't just lose the business. We lose everything." I stared at the black screen of the phone long after the line went dead, the silence heavier than the shouting. Derek's final words about the foreclosure vibrated in the humid air of the car like a death knell. I felt a cold, sharp determination settle over me, a hyper-focused clarity that usually only came when I was fixing a broken engine. But this time the machine was my life, and someone had intentionally poured sugar in the tank. I pulled Arthur Blackwell's business card from my pocket. As we walked toward the car, the embossed gold lettering feeling like a splinter under my skin. The sun caught the edges of the card, blinding me for a second. A gilded reminder of the man who had helped my son dismantle my world. Arthur Blackwell 56 was a shadow with a law degree and a Phoenix address, a man who had built a career on the ruins of people like me. We climbed into the rental car, the smell of hot asphalt and ozone trailing us inside. Laura didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, she took the card from my shaking hand and began typing furiously into her phone. The rhythmic tapping of her fingernails on the glass was the only sound against the hum of the AC fighting the Tucson noon heat. After a few minutes, her face went pale, then hardened into a mask of pure academic fury. She turned the screen toward me, showing a series of archived news articles and legal filings. My heart sank as she scrolled through the data. It turned out that Blackwell's firm wasn't just an outside consultant. His shell company was the primary lien holder on my house. He was the advisor who had told Derek to take the loan and the executioner who would pull the lever when it failed. A fixer is just a vulture with an MBA and a clean suit. He's a ghost, Dad. Laura said, her voice dropping an octave as she read from a 2019 investigation into moved assets in Phoenix. Derek didn't find him in the yellow pages, did he? I asked, my own voice sounding thin and old in the cramped space. No. Blackwell finds the desperate ones, she replied. He's a fixer for criminals in ties. I felt the dry, dusty feeling of the paper deed copies in the glove box, a stack of evidence that my own blood had signed my life away to a man who specialized in finding legal loopholes to drain family estates to pay off corporate creditors. He used you as a shield, Dad. He put your name on the debt so Blackwell could walk away with the cash. I'm scared, sweetheart, I admitted, my hand going to my chest. I've never fought a ghost before. You don't have to, she said. And for a moment the daughter I knew was gone, replaced by a warrior. You have me, and I'm going to take everything they stole back. This wasn't a business failure. It was a harvest. As we finally pulled out of the parking lot, the weight of the situation shifted. I realized that if the business account was frozen by the fraud, affidavit, Blackwell wouldn't wait for a legal process. He likely had an immediate default clause triggered the moment the bank flagged the suspicious activity. I had 24 hours to save my home. Laura gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white as marble. What if they needed you gone, Dad? Not just broke gone. The drive home felt longer than the 30 years I had lived in that house, every mile a step closer to a confrontation I was not sure I could survive. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles felt like they might burst through the skin. Beside me, Laura was a silent engine of kinetic energy, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror, as if expecting Blackwell himself to materialize out of the desert heat. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the normalcy of the neighborhood felt like a lie. The front door did not resist. It swung inward with a heavy, mocking silence that told me our sanctuary had been breached while we were fighting for my life at the bank. I knew I had locked it. I could still feel the phantom click of the deadbolt against my thumb from earlier that morning. A cold draft hit my face, smelling of dust and something metallic. I followed the air to the back of the house and felt my stomach drop. The back alley gate, my private escape, and the one secret I thought I held over this property stood wide open. They had not just entered. They had moved through my home with the confidence of owners. The violation felt like a physical weight on my chest. In the living room, the precise order I had maintained for decades had been surgically dismantled. My locked file cabinet sat in the corner, its drawer slightly askew. I ran my fingers over the rough texture of the jimmied metal, the smell of forced steel hanging in the air. The fireproof box was gone. Inside that box were the original property deed copies, the only physical proof of a life built on honest labor. I looked at Laura, my voice a jagged whisper. I locked this, Laura. I remember the click of the deadbolt. She did not look surprised, only grimmer. They are not looking for jewelry, Dad. They are looking for the original signatures. A home without a lock is just a box waiting to be emptied. And as I stood in my own living room, I realized I was standing in a hollowed-out shell. We moved to the kitchen, where the heavy thudding silence of the house seemed to grow thicker. The trash can had been overturned, but it was not a random act of vandalism. Scattered yellowed papers littered the tile floor. Laura knelt, sifting through the mess with a surgeon's focus. She pulled a sheaf of papers from the pile and held them up. My medical discharge papers from the hospital, the ones from my fall back in 2023, were gone. So were the prescriptions for the heavy sedatives I had been taking during my recovery. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why would they want my old medical records, I asked. Laura's eyes met mine with a look of calculated coldness. They are building a case to lock you away, and they are using your own history to do it. If they can prove you were incompetent back then, they can justify every transfer they made. How do you protect a life when the walls around you have started working for the enemy? The terror was no longer a distant threat. It was sitting at my kitchen table. Laura reached under the mahogany edge of the table and pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. Attached to the underside was a small, high-tech tracking device, its tiny red light blinking with a rhythmic, predatory pulse. I looked at the empty space in the cabinet where my late wife's medical power of attorney used to sit, and a cold realization washed over me. They were not just after my money anymore. The house felt like a stranger's skin, itchy and wrong, as Laura pulled her laptop back out to dig into the ruins of my son's ambition. I watched the blue light of the laptop screen dance in Laura's eyes, her fingers flying across the keys, like she was dismantling a bomb while I sat among the ruins of my living room. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the kitchen, a bitter reminder of a morning that had started with a quiet cup of joe and ended with the realization that my home was no longer mine. The blue glare reflected off the dust on the dining table, highlighting the fingerprints of the strangers who had just violated our privacy. I felt the dry, papery feel of my throat as I swallowed, but the water in my glass tasted like copper. Laura accessed the public records for Wright Construction LLC, her mouse clicking with a sharp, mechanical precision in the quiet room. She leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowing as she navigated through Pacer. "Dad, look at this," she whispered. The thriving family legacy Derek had boasted about was a hollow shell. There was a trail of unpaid suppliers stretching back months' lawsuits from former employees and multiple government liens that made my stomach churn. I realized then that my stolen pension had not been an investment for growth. It had been a desperate infusion of blood into a corpse. He didn't just use your money for a shortfall. Dad, Laura said, her eyes fixed on the data. He used it to pay interest on loans that should have never been taken. To my horror, she found a bankruptcy filing where Derek had officially listed me as a silent partner. He had tied me legally to every failed contract and predatory debt he had accrued. I built foundations for 40 years, Laura. I know when a structure is terminal, I said, my voice barely audible over the hum of the laptop fan. How much does a son have to hate his father to make him the captain of a sinking ship he didn't even know he owned? The investigation reached a fever pitch as Laura pulled up a consolidated debt statement. The total liabilities were staggering. $850,000. That's not a business debt. That's a black hole? I gasped. The amount was far more than the equity in my home, more than everything I had saved. And you're the one standing at the edge of it, Dad, Laura replied, her face grim. He tied your name to every cent of it. I realized Derek had gambled everything on a municipal contract that likely never existed, using me as the ultimate collateral for his greed. Numbers don't lie. Sons do. I felt a cold dread settling in my bones. Every time I had been confused or drugged during my recovery, they had been moving pieces on a board I could not see. Laura's fingers slowed as she found a recent wire transfer. While I was under the fog of sedatives, $50,000 had been sent to a shell company owned by Arthur Blackwell, not the construction firm. It was a direct kickback. Laura froze her cursor, hovering over a document titled Exit Strategy. She looked up at me, her face pale. "Dad, this isn't just about the debt. They have a buyer for the house. Already, the thought of a stranger walking through Dorothy's garden bought with my stolen blood sent a surge of heat through my chest that no sedative could ever dampen. I looked at Laura, and without a word, I led her toward the hallway. The door to Derek's old bedroom groaned on its hinges, a sound like a ghost clearing its throat, as we stepped into the space where my son had once dreamed of being a man of honor. Now it felt like a staging ground for a betrayal I was still struggling to map. The smell of mothballs and old cardboard hit me first heavy and suffocating. I went straight to the closet where I had seen Derek stashing mail he thought I was too slow to notice. We found a stack of envelopes hidden in the back behind his old Letterman jacket. I pulled out a glossy brochure for Saguaro Memory Care. My name was handwritten on a yellow sticky note on the cover, my own identity reduced to a label. I felt the crinkle of the glossy brochure pages beneath my thumbs, a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. As Laura opened it, my breath hitched. There was a pre-filled intake form detailing my supposed rapid onset dementia, and a schedule for a mandatory evaluation set for this coming Wednesday. But it was the stamp in the corner that made my vision blur. The Saguaro brochure showed a deposit-paid stamp dated 3 weeks before my fall in the garden. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The fall hadn't been an accident that led to the power of attorney. It had been the execution of a plan already in motion. Saguaro. That's where they put people who can't remember their own names. Laura. I whispered, the stinging heat of tears refusing to fall. They weren't waiting for you to get sick, Dad. They were making sure you looked the part, she replied. The brochure felt like a snake in my hand, slick, cold, and poisonous. Laura dug deeper into the stack, pulling out a correspondence log between Derek and Arthur Blackwell. It was a cold, calculated map of my destruction. It outlined a liquidation timeline where the house would be sold to a developer associated with Blackwell's firm. The brutal math was laid bare. The memory care facility fees would be paid by my house sale, leaving me isolated in a locked ward while Derek and Blackwell pocketed the remaining equity to settle the $850,000 debt. It says here, estimated recovery from asset sale $400,000. They already appraised it behind my back, I said, my voice trembling with a cold fury. This isn't a debt repayment, Dad. It's a funeral for a living man, Laura said. How do you mourn a son who is currently measuring you for a cage? I looked at my own name typed on a medical form, a death sentence written in bureaucratic ink. Just as I thought the betrayal couldn't cut any deeper, Laura pulled a folded document from the bottom of the pile. It was a copy of my will, but it had been amended. A forged signature. A poor imitation of my own hand left the entire estate solely to Wright Construction, LLC, in the event of my incapacity. I was being erased while I was still breathing. A sudden heavy thud sounded from the living room, followed by the unmistakable creak of the floorboard. I knew only groaned when someone was standing directly over the hidden safe. We froze Laura's hand, gripping the Saguaro brochure so hard the paper began to tear. The thud from the living room was followed by the unmistakable creak of the floorboard. I knew only groaned when someone was standing directly over the hidden safe. I gripped the heavy brass fire poker, my knuckles white, and my heart hammering against my ribs as I rounded the corner into the living room to face the thief who had come to finish the job. I was ready to swing, ready to defend the few scraps of my life that remained, until I saw the man standing by the hearth. Frank Peterson, 71. An old colleague with hands like leather and a voice like a gravel pit stood in my living room with a look of profound sorrow. "Frank Lord, you nearly got a fire poker to the head." I breathed the weapon trembling in my grasp. He looked at me then at the poker and sighed. "Derek told me you were too far gone to even recognize me, Charles. He's been telling the whole crew at the Union Hall you've lost your mind and that he was moving you to a specialized facility for your own safety." Frank explained he had used the spare key I gave him years ago, unable to reach me by phone and unwilling to believe the rumors. He had been investigating Derek's lies on my behalf for weeks. How do you tell an old friend that the son he used to bounce on his knee is now the man holding the matches to your life's work? I smelled the familiar tobacco and old work boots on him, a scent of the construction sites of my youth, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. But Frank didn't come to reminisce. He reached into his coat and pulled out a damp envelope. "Before I explain what this number on the document truly means, are you still with me? Comment 5 if you think Derek is acting alone, or 10 if Blackwell is the real architect, and add one short reason so I can see how you are reading this. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, as the core message is what matters most." Frank handed me the paper he found at the county clerk's office. It was a $200,000 second mortgage lien against the house. "I have no memory of signing this," I whispered, my voice breaking. Laura cross-referenced it on her laptop, her face turning ashen. "He used the power of attorney and a forged medical letter claiming you were incapable, Dad. I bought this dirt in 1979, Frank. I poured every ounce of my life into these walls. Dorothy and I paid this off 15 years ago." My eyes burned with the sharp, stinging heat of tears. "He didn't just borrow against it, Dad. He sold the ground right out from under your feet." The fire poker hit the carpet with a dull thud, my strength finally failing as the numbers on that lien began to blur. The papers showed the beneficiary was an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The money was gone untraceable and cold. I realized then that Blackwell's firm didn't just want the house. They wanted me erased so the debt would never be questioned. Frank gripped my shoulder, his eyes darting to the window. The rhythmic, urgent knocking of a truck engine sounded outside. "Charles, we have to move. Derek's truck just turned the corner, and he's not alone this time." The headlights of Derek's truck cut through the deepening shadows of the living room, a predator returning to the kill site. I watched from the window as the engine cut out, leaving a ringing silence that was quickly shattered by the slamming of heavy doors. The hammered pounding on my front door at 6 in the morning didn't sound like a son coming home. It sounded like an eviction notice with a heartbeat. My hands shook as I stood my ground, my daughter Laura and my old friend Frank flanking me like a human wall. When I finally pulled the door open, the cold morning desert air rushed in, carrying the sharp, synthetic scent of expensive cologne. Derek stood there disheveled and frantic, his eyes darting toward the safe. Beside him was Nicole, her face a mask of clinical detachment, and a tall man in a charcoal suit I recognized from the business card, Arthur Blackwell. Behind them, standing by the truck, were two large men in navy windbreakers. I realized with a jolt of ice in my veins that the medical escort Derek mentioned wasn't a team of doctors, but private security guards Blackwell brought to physically remove me if I didn't cooperate. "Step aside, Laura," Derek snapped, his voice cracking. "This is a family matter, and Dad needs professional care right now. We have a wellness professional here to assist with his transition. The only professional care he needs is a lawyer." Laura countered, her voice steady and sharp as a scalpel. "And luckily he has one on the way." Blackwell moved through my living room like a shark in a koi pond, smooth, silent, and looking for the softest place to bite. He didn't raise his voice, but the dry, rasping sound of his silk suit as he stepped past Derek filled the space with a terrifying legal precision. Mrs. Wright? Or is it Professor, my firm has been retained to protect your father's interests from outside interference? Blackwell said, his eyes scanning the room as if he already owned the furniture. You are currently trespassing in a residence under financial review. I'm not a firm, Mr. Blackwell. Laura spat back, refusing to yield an inch of the hardwood floor. I'm his daughter, and you're just the vulture who's been picking at his bones for 18 months. The air in the room became suffocating. 6 in the morning. The sun hadn't even found Tucson yet, but the heat in that room was already enough to burn the house down. Blackwell ignored her, turning his gaze toward me. He reached into a leather briefcase and pulled out a thin blue folder. He produced a document he claimed was a signed voluntary commitment, a paper that would authorize my immediate removal to Saguaro Memory Care. I leaned in, my eyes narrowing as I looked at the signature line. My breath hitched. The date on the document was from July 3 months ago. This wasn't a sudden medical decision. It was a long-term conspiracy they had been sitting on until the money ran dry. Blackwell leaned into my space, his breath smelling of expensive mint and cold calculations. Charles. He whispered low enough that only I could hear the edge of the blade. Make this easy. Otherwise, the police I've already called won't be coming to help you. I didn't back away. I couldn't. Not with my daughter standing there like a shield and my own life being bartered like scrap metal. Arthur Blackwell loomed over me, his presence a suffocating weight, in my own living room. He tapped a thick folder against his palm, the sound echoing like a gavel. You have 2 choices. Charles, walk out with dignity to a premier facility, or wait for the sheriff to remove you for your own safety. He gestured toward the window where the silhouettes of hired guards shifted in the early morning light, forming a physical perimeter around my sanity. Derek stepped forward, his face slick with a sour-smelling nervous sweat that I could smell from 3 feet away. Just sign it, Dad, he pleaded, his voice cracking. It is the only way to save what is left. It is for the best for the family. I looked at Nicole, who stood with her arms crossed, her eyes cold and clinical. In that moment of forced clarity, I realized how she had managed to keep me in a chemical fog without leaving a paper trail. As a high-level pharmaceutical representative, she had access to countless samples. She had been using her professional credentials to bypass every pharmacy record in the state, feeding me professional-grade oblivion from a briefcase rather than a prescription bottle. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. Blackwell clicked his expensive pen, the sharp sound cutting through the silence. Then he stopped, sensing the shift in the room. Laura didn't scream or cry. She simply reached into the pocket of her windbreaker and pulled out a small amber plastic bottle. The amber bottle rolled across the table, a tiny plastic drumbeat of justice. The sound of it hitting the cold, smooth mahogany coffee table was louder than any of Blackwell's threats. My daughter leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Nicole. This isn't a vitamin, Nicole, Laura said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. It is a Schedule IV controlled substance used to facilitate a $250,000 theft. I have already recorded our conversation from 10 minutes ago, including the admissions about the supplements you have been forcing on my father. Do you know what the mandatory minimum is for drugging an at-risk senior with stolen samples? Nicole's composure, usually as polished as her jewelry, finally cracked. Her breath hitched, and she looked at the bottle as if it were a live grenade. We were just helping him sleep, Laura. It is not what you think. She looked toward Blackwell for support, but the lawyer had already taken a strategic step back, his face a mask of neutral denial. The pale, early morning light stretched across the floor, illuminating the dust motes and the wreckage of my family's loyalty. How quickly does family love evaporate when the handcuffs start to rattle? I watched my son, the boy I had raised, to be a man of honor as he began to tremble. The fear of a cell was stronger than his greed. He looked at the bottle, then at his wife, and then at the recording device in Laura's hand. The alliance that had seemed so impenetrable minutes ago began to dissolve into a frantic, ugly desperation. Derek turned on Nicole, his voice a frantic screech that set my teeth on edge. "I told you he didn't need that much. I told you we should have just talked to him. It was your idea to use the samples, Nicole. I never wanted any of this." The room felt like it was losing oxygen as the alliance between my son and his wife turned into a feeding frenzy. I watched the two people I had welcomed into my heart tear each other apart like jackals over a fresh kill, but the real blow came when Laura pulled a stack of intercepted envelopes from her bag. They were tied with a piece of twine, the edges holding a paper-cut sharpness that seemed to threaten anyone who touched them. I recognized the scent of Laura's distinct lavender ink before she even spoke. "I wrote every month, Dad," she said, her voice trembling with 4 years of repressed agony. "I sent photos of my students, my classroom, and letters telling you I was sorry for the fight we had. Derek told me you burned them without opening them. He told me you never wanted to hear my name again." My heart constricted as I looked at Derek. I remembered that day 4 years ago, the screaming match that had severed my relationship with my daughter. I realized now that the argument hadn't been a spontaneous explosion of temper. Derek had spent weeks misquoting Laura to me and twisting my words to her, whispering poison into our ears until the bridge was ready to collapse. He hadn't just watched us fall out. He had engineered the cliff we were standing on. "I didn't burn them." Derek stammered, his hands shaking as he reached out toward the letters before pulling back. "I just didn't want you upsetting him with your choices. I was trying to keep the house peaceful." Peace was just a euphemism for isolation, a way to ensure no one was left to question the steady drain of my bank accounts. "How do you calculate the interest on 4 years of stolen I love yous?" I looked at the letters, each one a heartbeat I had been denied. The cold, early morning wind whistled through the front door, which Blackwell had left ajar in his desperation to find an exit strategy. But Laura wasn't finished. She reached back into her bag and produced a folder of bank transfer receipts. $10,000, Derek, she said, slamming the papers onto the coffee table. "I sent $500 every few months specifically for Dad's extra comforts and birthday gifts. I wanted him to have the best care, not to pay for Blackwell's tailored suits." She pointed at the receipts, showing the money had been wired directly into Derek's construction payroll account. I looked down at my threadbare sweater and thought of the empty fridge I had stared into just yesterday. He had stolen from both of us. The envelopes were still sealed, 4 years of my daughter's life, trapped in paper and Derek's greed. The silence that followed was hollow and echoing, filled only by the sound of Derek's ragged breathing. He looked at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. It wasn't just the money, I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "You made me think she hated me, and you made her think I was a senile ghost. You let me grieve for a daughter who was still reaching out." Derek let out a dry, hacking sob, his resolve finally disintegrating. "It wasn't just me," he blurted out, pointing a trembling finger at Nicole. "She was the one who forged the handwriting on those thank you notes I sent to Laura. She said it would keep the scam alive so we wouldn't lose the extra cash." I looked Derek in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my son. I saw a stranger who had been wearing his face while he picked my pockets. "You didn't just steal my money, Derek. You murdered my family." The ghost of my wife Dorothy seemed to fill the room as I turned toward the sofa where she had taken her last breath. I turned my gaze to the velvet sofa in the corner, that very spot where her journey ended in 2021, and I felt her fierce spirit rise within me like a desert gale. Derek looked at me, his eyes rimmed with red, but I wasn't finished. "I wasn't the only one watching this collapse," I said, gesturing toward the kitchen door where Frank Peterson stood. My neighbor held his smartphone steady, the screen glowing with a record of everything Blackwell had threatened and every confession Derek had spat out in his panic. The look on Blackwell's face shifted from predatory to paralyzed. I looked back at my son, who was trembling. "She gripped your hand in this very room, Derek. Her last breath was a prayer that you would look after me. Do you remember what you whispered to her? You promised you would be my rock." Derek collapsed into a high-backed chair, his face buried in his shaking hands. "I tried, Dad," he sobbed, the sound hollow and echoing against the walls. "I was just drowning in debt. The business was failing. I thought if I just took a little from the equity—" "No," I interrupted, my voice as cold as a mountain stream. "You don't honor a mother by burying a father alive. You took the one thing she valued more than this house, which was our family's integrity." The room fell silent. As the first siren wailed in the distance, the sound of the world finally rushing back in. The rhythmic strobing of police lights began to splash blue and red across the floral wallpaper, a garish reminder that the private nightmare was now a public matter. Officer Barnes, a stern man with a buzz cut and a badge that caught the morning light, stepped into my hallway, like the embodiment of the order I had lost. Beside him was Officer Sullivan, younger and observant, already pulling out a pair of latex gloves to handle the pill bottle. Laura stepped forward with a poise that made me ache with pride. "Officers, we have physical evidence of unauthorized sedation and financial coercion," she said, handing over the Ambien and the legal pad of notes. Arthur Blackwell immediately grabbed his briefcase, attempting to slide toward the exit. "I have a client meeting, I really must." "Nobody leaves the premises." Officer Barnes barked, his hand resting near his belt. "We need statements from everyone involved. Can a house ever feel clean again after it has been a crime scene for 2 years?" I tasted the sharp, stinging taste of bile in my throat as the reality of the investigation took hold. Nicole was sitting on the edge of the hearth, her thumbs flying across her phone screen in a desperate blur. Officer Barnes moved with surprising speed, snatching the device from her hands, just as she tried to wipe a thread of messages. "This is evidence now, ma'am," he said firmly. I watched the cold, metallic click of handcuffs as Sullivan secured Derek's wrists. The boy's sobbing now a pathetic whimper. The smell of crisp morning air and exhaust fumes drifted in through the open door, mixing with the scent of my old life. I watched through the window as they led Arthur Blackwell toward a cruiser in handcuffs. But my heart stopped when I saw a second car pull up, a process server with a final notice for my front door. The sirens faded, leaving a silence in the house that was no longer heavy, but incredibly terrifyingly empty. The blue ink of the process server's notice was still wet on the mahogany table, a cold reminder that while the criminals were in handcuffs, the law was still coming for my house. I felt the dry, papery feel of the foreclosure notice between my fingers as I realized the cruel efficiency of the man I had once trusted. This server hadn't been sent by the state or a neutral bank. He was working for a subsidiary of Blackwell's firm that had survived the initial arrest. A legal tripwire specifically designed to trigger foreclosure immediately upon any legal disturbance at the property. Even from a jail cell, Blackwell's shadow was trying to evict me from my own life. 2 weeks after the arrests, I found myself in a room that smelled of old leather and expensive stationery. Paul Gutierrez, 58, an attorney with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too many children rob their parents, adjusted his glasses as he laid out the grim reality of my estate. He sat across from Laura and me, the sharp, rhythmic ticking of a desktop clock on his mantle marking the seconds of my dwindling legacy. "The handcuffs on Blackwell don't automatically dissolve the lien," Charles Paul explained, his voice low and steady. "We are fighting a bank now, not just a man. We have a $200,000 lien to vacate and nearly $500,000 in missing pension funds to track." I felt the room tilt the blurred edges of the mahogany desk, making me feel dizzy with guilt. "How long, Paul? How long before they take the keys?" He didn't sugarcoat it. "The holding company is pushing for expedited foreclosure. Unless we can prove fraudulent inducement in record time and get the lien declared void, They'll proceed with the sale in 60 days, maybe less. The next morning, Paul brought us to a sterile conference room on the third floor of Bank of America's regional headquarters. The smell of industrial coffee and cold air conditioning filled the space as we sat across from three stone-faced bank representatives, a senior vice president named Catherine Reeves, a risk management director, and a corporate attorney who introduced himself only as counsel. Laura sat beside me, her legal pad already covered in notes, her pen poised like a weapon. Paul opened with precision, laying out a thick binder of evidence on the polished table. My client, Charles Wright, was systematically drugged with prescription sedatives over an 18-month period, while his son, acting under a fraudulently obtained power of attorney, transferred nearly $500,000 from his pension account. Your institution approved a $200,000 second mortgage lien against a property that was already fully paid off, using forged medical documentation, claiming my client was mentally incapacitated. The bank attorney leaned forward, his fingers steepled. Mr. Gutierrez, the power of attorney, was notarized and filed in accordance with state law. The medical letters were submitted by a licensed family member. We followed protocol. Protocol, Laura's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Your protocol allowed a son to drain his father's life savings while he was being chemically sedated. Your protocol didn't include a single welfare check or a phone call to verify the legitimacy of transfers that violated every pattern in my father's 40-year banking history. Catherine Reeves shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering to a printout of my account history. We understand your frustration, Professor Wright, but the bank is not liable for family disputes. The lien was approved based on the documentation provided. The documentation was fraudulent. Paul countered, sliding a medical affidavit across the table. This is a sworn statement from my client's primary care physician, confirming he was never diagnosed with dementia or cognitive impairment. The letters submitted to your loan department were forgeries created by Arthur Blackwell, a man now under federal indictment for elder financial abuse and fraud. The risk management director cleared his throat, his face pale. If the lien is declared void, the bank loses $200,000. That's not a decision we can make in this room. Paul leaned back, his voice dropping into a deadly calm register. Then let me make this simple. You have two choices. Option 1, we go to court. I file a lawsuit alleging negligence, failure to protect a vulnerable senior, and complicity in a fraud scheme. The discovery process will expose every shortcut your loan department took to push this through. The press will have a field day with a 70-year-old retired foreman who was drugged and robbed while your bank looked the other way. How do you think that plays in a jury trial? The silence in the room was suffocating. The corporate attorney's jaw tightened. Option 2. Paul continued. You declare the lien void due to fraudulent inducement. You absorb the $200,000 loss as the cost of failing to perform adequate due diligence. In exchange, my client agrees not to pursue civil litigation against the bank for oversight failures. You walk away with your reputation intact. He walks away with his home. Catherine Reeves exchanged a long, tense look with the attorney. The rhythmic hum of the conference room's ventilation system filled the silence. Finally, she spoke. We would need a full release of liability. No future claims, no press statements, no social media. Paul glanced at me, his eyebrow raised in a silent question. I looked at Laura, whose eyes were fierce and unwavering. I thought of Dorothy, of the 36 years I had poured into that house of the garden where her ashes rested. I nodded. Done, Paul said. But the lien gets removed today. Not next week. Today. 20 minutes later, I watched Catherine Reeves sign the release order, the scratch of her pen on the legal document sounding like the closing of a tomb. The $200,000 lien against my home was officially dissolved. The house was mine again. But the victory tasted hollow. After Paul finished the assessment and the bank representatives left, he stepped out to make a copy of the settlement agreement. My eyes wandered to the ledger on his desk. landing on a receipt for a massive retainer payment. Retainer paid $25,000. Source: Laura Wright. The number burned like acid in my eyes. I looked at the document, then at my daughter, who was quietly reviewing the settlement terms. Laura, I thought the bank was deferring the fees while the investigation was pending. I whispered. I thought we were using the frozen accounts. She didn't look up immediately, her jaw set in a line of weary determination. The bank doesn't work for free, Dad, she said softly. But I do, Paul returned, and seeing my confusion, he added a detail that felt like a physical blow to my chest. He mentioned that the wire transfer had come from her Portland equity fund, the money she had spent a decade saving for her own home. My breath hitched as the realization settled in. She hadn't just paid a bill. She had liquidated her entire future to patch the holes her brother had punched in mine. I learned then that she had already sold her car and taken an indefinite sabbatical from her university chair position just to stay in Tucson and manage this wreckage. I gripped the edge of the desk, my voice a broken whisper as I looked at my daughter. Laura, why didn't you tell me you were bankrupting yourself for a father who didn't even believe in you? The walk back to the car felt like wading through deep water, the weight of Laura's sacrifice pressing against my chest, harder than the theft ever had. I watched the news of Wright Construction's Chapter 11 filing crawl across the television screen, like a line of black ants devouring the last of my son's pride. The flickering, staticky sound of the TV news report filled the living room, a funeral dirge for a legacy built on sand. The news anchor's voice, clinical and detached, detailed the collapse. Wright Construction, LLC, once a prominent subcontractor in the Tucson metro area, has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company lists $850,000 in liabilities, with assets valued at less than $30,000. Creditors include suppliers, former employees, and multiple municipal contractors. I stared at the screen, the numbers burning into my retinas. 30,000. That was all that remained of the empire Derek had convinced himself he was building. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, Derek's voice came through thin and brittle. He was calling from a burner phone, his breath hitched in a way that signaled total defeat. She is gone, Dad. Nicole left. He said it with a flat, hollow tone that carried no surprise, only the echo of a man who had finally hit the bottom. She said I should have finished the plan before Laura got here. She said I was weak. She took everything that wasn't already frozen, cleaned out the joint account, packed her car, and left a note on the kitchen counter that just said, "Good luck with your father." The betrayal within the betrayal was staggering. Derek admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of shame, that Nicole was actually the one who intercepted Laura's $10,000 in gifts, siphoning the cash for personal maintenance and luxury while he was blinded by his own mounting business debts. I thought she was helping me, Dad. I thought she was on my side. But she was just using both of us. She kept telling me you'd never notice that Laura would never come back, that we had time to fix everything before anyone found out. He let out a jagged, hollow laugh that sounded more like a death rattle. I was so stupid. I destroyed everything and she walked away without a scratch. So that was the price of your soul, Derek. I asked, my voice devoid of the anger I thought I would feel. A construction yard and a wife who only loved your ledger. He didn't answer immediately, only let out a jagged sob. I don't even have the yard anymore, Dad. The equipment was all leased. The trucks were repoed this morning. I have a storage unit full of paperwork and a criminal investigation hanging over my head. I'm living in a motel off Oracle Road. I can't even afford to eat. I closed my eyes. The image of my son, the boy who used to climb on my shoulders at construction sites, the young man who had promised Dorothy he would be my rock, now reduced to a voice on a burner phone in a $40 a night motel. What do you want me to say? Derek, that I forgive you, that I'll fix this. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling static. I needed you to know I'm sorry. I needed to hear your voice one more time before I disappear. Disappear, my heart seized. Derek, what are you talking about? Blackwell's associates, he said, his voice dropping to a terrified rasp. They've been calling. They say the debt doesn't go away just because he's in jail. They say I still owe them the interest on the loans he facilitated. Dad, I don't have anything left to give them. The line went dead. I stared at the silent phone in my hand, the hollow dial tone echoing in the empty room. Without my pension to act as a dam, the house of cards had collapsed in 48 hours, leaving him with nothing but a mountain of debt and a folder full of potential criminal charges. Chapter 11. It sounds so clinical, but it smells like ash and failure. I hung up the phone and drove. I needed a counsel that lived beyond the reach of attorneys and bank statements. I found myself at the Tucson cemetery as the sky began to turn into the golden bruising colors of a desert sunset. The smell of dry sage and cemetery grass was sharp in the cooling air, the distant sound of a lone coyote howling across the desert floor, a fitting soundtrack to my grief. I sat on the granite bench by Dorothy's headstone, feeling the cold, rough texture of the stone through my trousers. The carved letters of her name, Dorothy Ann Wright, 1957 to 2021. Beloved wife and mother seemed to glow in the fading light. He is broken, Dorothy, I whispered into the stillness, just like the structures he tried to build. What do I do? The heavy, rhythmic thud of my own heart was the only answer for a long time. I traced the outline of her name with my fingertips, the stone cold and unyielding under my touch. You asked me to protect him. You made me promise right here in this very spot that I wouldn't let him fall. But how do I protect a man from himself? How do I save a son who used me as collateral for his own greed? A memory surfaced sharp and vivid, cutting through the fog of my anger. It was 1985. Derek was 5 years old, and I had taken him to a job site where we were pouring the foundation for a new municipal building. He had been fascinated by the concrete mixer, the way the thick gray slurry flowed into the wooden forms. Dad, what happens if you pour it wrong? He had asked, his small hand gripping mine. What happens if the foundation cracks? Then the whole building is weak, son, I had told him. No matter how pretty it looks on the outside, if the foundation is rotten, the whole thing will come down eventually. That's why we measure twice and pour once. That's why we do it right the first time. I had been teaching him about integrity, about the importance of a solid foundation. How had he forgotten that lesson? Or had I failed to teach him the most important part, that integrity isn't just about the structures you build, but about the life you live? I wrestled with the ghost of her deathbed request. She had asked me to protect him. But could I protect a man from the consequences of his own predation? Can a man truly be a father if he doesn't let his son face the winter he created? I asked the empty air, the question hanging heavy in the cooling desert breeze. Accountability isn't punishment, Charles. I could almost hear her voice in the rustle of the dry grass and the distant cry of the coyote. It is the only way to save what is left of him. You don't save a man by shielding him from the truth. You save him by making him strong enough to face it. A new resolution began to form, hard and cold as the granite beneath me. I realized that sending him to a cell might satisfy my anger, but it wouldn't fix the hole he had dug for Laura. It wouldn't restore the 10 years she had spent saving for a home, the car she had sold, the career she had paused. Derek needed to face the consequences, but he also needed a path forward, not for his sake, but for hers. I would offer him a way out of the criminal drugging charges, but only if he signed a legally binding restitution agreement. Every cent he earned, every asset he managed to salvage, would go to paying back Laura's savings first. He would spend the next decade maybe more rebuilding what he had destroyed, not for me, not for himself, but for the sister he had betrayed. I brushed the desert dust off Dorothy's headstone and stood up, my knees popping with the weight of 70 years. The sun had fully set now, the sky a deep purple bruise streaked with gold. The cemetery lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the graves. "I have my answer, sweetheart," I said aloud, my voice steady and clear. "He's going to face the truth, even if it kills the man he used to be. And maybe, just maybe, a better man will rise from the ashes." As I walked back to the car, I pulled out my phone and dialed Paul Gutierrez. "Paul, it's Charles. I need you to draft a restitution agreement. Full terms, ironclad, no loopholes. Derek pays back every cent Laura spent with interest before he keeps a dime for himself. And I want a clause that if he defaults, the criminal charges get refiled. He gets one chance. One." Paul was silent for a moment. Then I heard the scratch of pen on paper. "I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning, Charles. Are you sure about this?" I looked back at Dorothy's grave, the headstone glowing faintly in the cemetery lights. "I'm sure. It's what she would have wanted. Not forgiveness without accountability, but accountability with mercy." "Understood," Paul said. "I'll see you at 9. I hung up and climbed into the car. The engine roared to life, and as I drove away from the cemetery, I felt the first true sense of peace I had known in 2 years. The road ahead was long and the wounds were deep, but for the first time I knew the direction. Forward. Always forward. The drive back from the cemetery felt different. The road wasn't a getaway path anymore. It was a way forward. The morning sun flooded my kitchen for the first time in months, illuminating the scars on the wooden table where I finally signed the papers that returned my name to my life. I watched the golden dust motes dancing in the light, a silent celebration of a home reclaimed. The smell of fresh coffee, real coffee, not the instant powder Derek had left in the cupboards, filled the air, a small luxury that suddenly felt monumental. Paul Gutierrez sat across from me, his expression uncharacteristically soft as he watched me grip the pen. Beside him, Derek sat with his head bowed, looking years older than he had just a week ago. His hands, once smooth and manicured from years behind a desk, were already calloused and dirt-stained from 3 days of day labor on a landscaping crew. The expensive cologne was gone, replaced by the honest smell of sweat and sun-baked earth. Surprisingly, Derek told us that Blackwell had reached out through a back channel, offering him a stash of cash to flee to Phoenix and disappear before the state task force could dig deeper. "He called me from jail." Dad, Derek said, his voice hollow. "He told me there was $50,000 in a safety deposit box in Scottsdale. All I had to do was take it and disappear. He said if I testified against him, his associates would make sure I never made it to trial. But my son had refused." Derek looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. I thought about it. God help me, I stood in that motel room for 3 hours staring at the address he gave me. But then I thought about Mom. I thought about what she would say if she could see me now. And I realized I couldn't run anymore. I've been running from the truth for 2 years. And all it did was destroy everything I loved. He chose to sit at this table and sign the restitution papers as his first act of genuine accountability. Paul slid the thick legal document across the mahogany surface, the pages crisp and official. "This agreement stipulates full restitution of $25,000 to Attorney Gutierrez for legal fees, and the remainder, approximately $87,000, to be paid directly to Laura Wright over a period not to exceed 10 years, Paul explained, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a man who had seen too many families torn apart by greed. Any default on monthly payments will result in immediate reinstatement of criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. You will also be required to attend court-mandated financial counseling and submit quarterly income statements for review. Derek picked up the pen, his hand shaking so badly the first signature was barely legible. "I know this doesn't fix anything," he said, his voice cracking. "I know you'll never look at me the same way, but I need you to know. I need Laura to know. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become the man Mom thought I was." I watched the scratch of the pen on legal parchment as we finalized the agreement. Each stroke felt like a small stitch in a wound that would never fully heal, but at least it was finally being closed. "It is done," Charles Paul said, sliding the last folder into his briefcase. "The house lien is officially dissolved due to the proven fraud, and your pension is now secured under an independent trust that no one else can touch. The house is yours again. Truly yours." I looked at Derek, who stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the tile floor, with a sound that felt final. "I will pay it back, Laura. Every cent." He said, his voice a gravelly whisper, as he turned toward the hallway where Laura stood silent and watchful. "I am sorry." Laura didn't move. Her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't need your apology, Derek. I need your follow-through. Words are cheap. Show me you mean it." Derek nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her judgment. He looked at me one last time, and I saw a flicker of the boy I had raised, broken but not beyond repair. I looked him in the eye, my voice firm but no longer poisoned by the old rage. "Don't tell me you are sorry, Derek. Show me you are right." He nodded once and left to begin his new life as a day laborer, carrying the weight of his choices out into the Arizona heat. Through the window, I watched him climb into a battered pickup truck, borrowed from his new crew boss, the vehicle a far cry from the silver luxury truck he had once driven with such arrogance. A signature is just ink on paper, but today it felt like the first breath of oxygen after being held underwater for 2 years. Later that afternoon, the house smelled of floor wax and lemon oil as Laura and I began the slow process of reorganization. The oppressive stale air that had hung over the rooms for months was finally lifting, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of renewal. While cleaning out a drawer of Dorothy's old things to make room for Laura's stay, I found a book of poetry I hadn't opened since the funeral, the collected works of Mary Oliver, Dorothy's favorite. Tucked inside was an old yellowed photograph of Dorothy and a young Laura, maybe 8 years old, standing in front of the half-built house in 1991. Dorothy's arm was wrapped around Laura's shoulders, both of them squinting into the desert sun, their smiles wide and unguarded. I pulled it out, noticing the yellowed, papery smell of the past, the edges soft from decades of being pressed between pages. On the back, in Dorothy's elegant script, was a note written years ago. "Laura, my fierce girl, your father worries you are too soft for this hard world. But I know the truth. Your stubborn heart and your refusal to bend will be the very thing that saves this family when the shadows grow too long. Never stop being exactly who you are. Love, Mom." The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the words hit me with the force of a freight train. Why is it that the hardest words for a father to say are the ones his child has been waiting to hear their entire life? My throat tightened as I realized Dorothy had seen my secret doubts about Laura's career path all along and left this message specifically to be found when I needed it most. She had known long before I did that Laura's strength wasn't the kind I recognized, but it was the kind that would matter when everything else failed. I called Laura into the hallway, my voice breaking into a soft, shaky sob. "I was wrong, Laura. 4 years ago, I was so wrong about you." She reached for me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Dad, you don't have to say it." "I do," I insisted, gripping the photograph like a lifeline. "I worked a job I didn't love for 30 years because I thought that was the only definition of strength. I thought putting food on the table and keeping the lights on was all that mattered. But you You followed your passion, and in the end, that passion is what brought you home to save me. Your mother knew. She always knew. Laura took the photo from my hand, her fingers tracing the outline of her younger self. She used to tell me that she whispered. Every time you and I fought about my choices, she would pull me aside and say, "Your father loves you. He just doesn't know how to say it yet." She was right, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I love you, Laura. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry it took me 70 years and losing everything to finally see what was right in front of me all along. Laura pulled me into a fierce hug, and for the first time in years, I felt the crack in my chest begin to heal. I realized the most important bridge I ever built wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was the one leading back to my daughter. The house felt lighter. The shadows that had lived in the corners for years finally chased away by the truth. 6 months have passed since that morning at the kitchen table, and the Tucson air no longer tastes like dust and betrayal. It tastes like the slow, sweet victory of a man who has reclaimed the right to his own silence. I sit on my back porch, the feel of the warm sun on my weathered skin acting as a healing balm. In the garden below, the desert jasmine is in full bloom, sending a thick, sweet scent drifting through the air, mingling with the earthy smell of freshly turned soil. The hummingbirds have returned their iridescent wings, catching the morning light, as they dart between the trumpet vines Dorothy planted 20 years ago. Laura has transitioned to a remote teaching position to stay close, and the garden is thriving under our joint care. She teaches her university courses from the converted sunroom, her voice drifting through the open windows as she lectures on American literature and social justice. Sometimes I sit in the kitchen and listen to her passionate explanations of Baldwin and Morrison, and I think about how close I came to never hearing that voice again. Every month, a small envelope arrives in the mail from Derek. The checks are modest, $275, the maximum he can manage, after paying rent on a studio apartment in South Tucson and covering the court-mandated counseling fees. But I do not keep a single cent for myself. The first envelope had arrived with a short handwritten note on the back. Week 1. Framing crew. Hands are blistered, but I showed up on time. D. Each subsequent envelope carries a similar update, a small testament to a man trying to rebuild himself from the ground up. Last month's note read, "Foreman said I'm reliable. First time anyone said that in years. Still sober, still showing up. I have donated the first 6 months of my son's restitution money to a local legal aid clinic for seniors, the Sonoran Elder Justice Project, a small nonprofit that operates out of a converted storefront near the university. It gives me a grim sense of satisfaction to know that his penance is directly funding the protection of others who might be standing where I once stood. Last week, the clinic director, a fierce young attorney named Maria Santos, called to tell me that Derek's contributions had helped them take on 3 new cases of financial exploitation. Your son's money just saved a 73-year-old woman from losing her home to a predatory reverse mortgage scheme, she said. I didn't tell Derek. Some lessons are best learned in silence. I hear the rhythmic, comforting sound of garden shears from the rose bushes. You have got the pruning shears upside down again, Dad. Laura calls out, her voice bright and clear. I look over the railing and offer a small, knowing smile. I am just testing your observation skills, Professor. You passed. She laughs, a sound that has finally returned to these walls, and goes back to her work. The house is no longer a cage. It is a shared sanctuary of mutual respect. 3 weeks ago, Derek asked if he could visit. It was the first time he had requested anything since the signing. Laura and I discussed it over coffee on the porch, the conversation careful and measured. I'm not ready to have him in the house yet, she admitted, her hands wrapped around her mug. But maybe we could meet somewhere neutral, so we arranged to meet at the cemetery at Dorothy's grave. Derek arrived early, and when Laura and I pulled up, we found him kneeling on the grass, pulling weeds from around the headstone with his bare hands. He had brought fresh flowers, desert marigolds, Dorothy's favorite. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He simply said, "I come here every Sunday now." I talk to her. I tell her what I'm doing to fix things. Laura nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and the three of us stood in silence for a long time. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. I know you are listening. Maybe you are sitting in a room right now that feels like it is shrinking around you, watching the walls close in while someone tells you that your memory is failing or your worth has expired. I address you now because I was nearly one of the disappeared. They will tell you that you are a ghost before you are even dead. Don't believe them. The mask of confusion that others try to slip over your head is only as strong as the fear that holds it in place. I have learned that courage isn't always a loud shout or a grand gesture. Sometimes it is just the steady hand that refuses to sign the paper. It is the quiet, stubborn refusal to stay in the dark when someone else is trying to blow out your candle. Truth is like the desert sun. You can try to shade your eyes, but it will eventually burn through every shadow you try to hide in. My son tried to erase me, but in doing so, he only forced me to find the man I had forgotten I was. Now I spend my evenings working with a small, anonymous advocacy group I started for elder rights. We call ourselves the Silver Shield Network, and we meet twice a week in the basement of the public library. There are 8 of us now. Survivors of financial abuse, guardianship, exploitation, and medical coercion. We share our stories, offer resources, and most importantly, we listen. Last month, a woman named Helen, 81, came to us after her nephew tried to force her into signing over her home. We connected her with Maria Santos at the legal aid clinic, and within 2 weeks the power of attorney was revoked, and her nephew was under investigation. Helen hugged me after the meeting, her thin arms surprisingly strong. "You saved my life," she whispered. I thought of the hollow man I had been 6 months ago, the ghost shuffling through his own hallways, and I realized that in saving others, I had completed the work of saving myself. The senile man Derek tried to manufacture has become a formidable guardian of justice, a ghost that learned how to bite back. My voice is steady and clear now, a tone that has found its permanent strength. Frank Peterson, my old colleague, joined the group 3 weeks ago. He brings coffee and donuts every Wednesday, and we sit in the fluorescent-lit library basement swapping war stories and legal strategies. "You know what the irony is, Charles," he said last week. "Derek thought he was burying you. Instead, he turned you into the one thing he should have feared most, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." I turn my face to the warmth of the sun and whisper a final thank you to Dorothy, looking at the vibrant, cared-for home she left behind. The roses are blooming again, their petals a deep crimson that reminds me of her favorite lipstick. The kitchen table, once a site of betrayal, now hosts weekly dinners where Laura and I cook together, her laughter echoing off the tiles as I inevitably burn the garlic bread. Our story did not end with a signature or a court date, but with the choice to stand up and walk out of the dark. I know the way now, and I will make sure no one else has to walk it alone. As the sun sets over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, I feel Dorothy's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Charles," I can almost hear her say. "You finally built something that will last." And for the first time in 2 years, I believe her. Looking back at this painful family story, I realize something that still stings. I spent decades building houses strong enough to survive desert storms, yet I failed to notice the cracks forming inside my own home. This family story is not only about betrayal, it is about silence, pride, and the danger of trusting blindly. I believed that keeping peace meant avoiding hard questions. I believed my own blood would never turn against me. I was wrong. If there is one lesson I can leave behind through this family story, it is this: never surrender your voice, just to keep the illusion of harmony. Pay attention to actions, not promises. Protect your independence, your finances, and your dignity, especially when you grow older. Many people call what happened to me dad revenge, but the truth is more complicated. This dad revenge was never about hatred. It was about survival and about protecting what my late wife built beside me. Even so, every dad revenge comes with a cost, because when family breaks something inside, you breaks too. Today, I try to hold on to faith and humility. I believe the timing of the Lord guided my daughter back to me when the darkness was deepest. Without her courage, my story might have ended very differently. So if you learn anything from my experience, let it be this. Ask difficult questions early, protect your boundaries, and never assume that love alone will keep you safe. Thank you for walking with me all the way to the end of this journey. I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were trapped in Charles Wright's position? Share your perspective in the comments so we can learn from each other. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories that explore difficult family choices and resilience. Quick note, while inspired by real social issues like elder financial abuse, certain details in this narrative were dramatized for storytelling. If this type of content isn't your preference, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that may suit you better.